Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic, let's do it. What's the most strange, weird, or unsettling thing you've ever seen? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Seeing my Gramps after he committed suicide was pretty weird, and traumatic, and disturbing. He had to shoot himself twice because the first shot missed his heart, pacemaker. They be tough on bullets, apparently. So he had to go for a second shot. Imagining him sitting there, after summoning the strength for a suicide, only to have to re-muster and trigger again. What kind of thoughts was he having? The entire time. The misery, the fortitude, the fear. Seeing his body haunted me for months after. The whole thing is so surreal, but also too real. I don't know how to describe it. It's like seeing a horror movie, but it's actually Grandpa. Because he was sick and couldn't die when he needed to. I don't blame him, and I actually understand his choices, but seeing him like that, smelling the blood, seeing all the blood, there was a lot. Having the police there investigating a potential homicide because the whole 2 shots, hearing my mom get the call that he'd shot himself, and us rushing to the scene, going to the funeral home and making sure the wounds would be covered so he could have an open casket like he'd wanted with his favorite Navajo blanket wrapped around him. Reconciling the bloody, heaped-over old man in his pajama pants with the strong grandpa who'd bounced me on his knee and called me my grandma Love so much I thought it was her actual name when I was little. He was ornery and not perfect, but he shouldn't have had to die like that, and he's why I fully believe in assisted suicide. The whole thing was a trip from a gut level to a profound spiritual level, and it changed me. I've seen a lot of bad things in life, a lot of death. His death was far from my first at the time, but seeing him like that changed my perspective on a lot of things, and it still impacts me years later in ways I don't even know now until I really think about it. Had a young man fall off the balcony of our building, 13th floor. I could hear this woman screaming, and I ran down thinking she was in danger. As I was coming outside, I saw the young man. His head was non-existent, and she was screaming this guttural scream, but her face wasn't moving. It was horrible. I grabbed her to stop and try her to pick him up. When it was all over, I walked across to the bar and stayed drunk for 2 days. 6 days ago. Edited 6 days ago. I was working at a gas station removing monitoring wells when a Mini Cooper got T-boned by a van who ran the red in an adjacent intersection. It was the crack of dawn, so we were the only people out. The Mini was hit so hard the car jumped the curb and came to a smoking stop only 5 feet from me and my crew. We were like deer in headlights. No one jumped out of the way. We just hear a deafening crash, and by the time we're looking up, the car is already in front of us. We snap out of it, call 911 and try to help the guy. We can't open the driver's side door. The guy was clearly unconscious, blood was everywhere, and he was convulsing. In minutes, the cavalry arrives. Fire department, police, paramedics, and eventually 2 suits show up, detectives. While the guy is getting cut out of the car and we're being interviewed, the Mini driver's roommate, friend, maybe significant, was at the gas station losing it. No one was helping him since he was just a civilian, so all he had was us. He kept asking what he should do through endless tears. We told him to find out what hospital the driver was going to and tell his family. He thanked us and left. The roommate and the driver lived only 3 houses away. The roommate heard the crash and ran over. I find out why the suits were there. The Mini driver was dead, or guaranteed to be dead by the time they got to the hospital, so the incident was potentially considered homicide. We get released by the police, and my supervisor tells all of us to leave immediately and go home. Over the next 2 weeks, I'm in a lot of meetings. I work for a very large firm with a big health and safety culture. Had we decided to remove a different well that morning, maybe the car plows through me and my crew, and now there are 4 dead bodies instead of 1. But what I found the most jarring, other than seeing a man die in his car, was how everything played out, and firsthand seeing the incredible unfairness of it all. The guy who was hit was a young guy who lived just 3 houses away. He did everything right, and a van runs a red and kills him. My crew and myself could be dead, but luckily we started the day where we started, and nothing happened to us. The roommate is going to have to notify family and now deal with the terrible loss. For the fire department, police, paramedics, it's just another day. For my company, it's just another near-miss line item. And the cherry on top? The van driver was fine. I was told by one of the police the van driver was eating oatmeal while driving and didn't see the red. A man's life might have ended over oatmeal. I don't dwell on this story often, but it stuck with me. I'm not sure if I could call it disturbing, but it's undeniably awful. Gotta be a tie between a guy getting so many shots to the chest that the insides slid out when my friend stumbled into what he thought was a pile of clothes but was actually a body. I had to clean the greasy gunk off his hands and calm him down. That day I learned it's really easy to convince hysterical people of things, because I somehow convinced him he didn't just land in a rotten corpse. San Francisco, late 90s, was effing nuts. When I was a kid, maybe 10 to 12, my father's friend told us that there was a wounded deer with 2 broken legs struggling to move down the road to our house, in a very, very rural area. Nearest neighbor was miles away. My older brother was and is a very disturbed person. He said, "Let's go find the deer," and we went down and found the poor thing. It must have been hit by a car. So my brother said we have to put it out of its misery, and then he brandished a big Rambo buck knife he brought with him and ran up to the deer and hopped onto it, and then proceeded to stab the deer right there, the chest and lung area. The noise of the deer yelping and the hissing of air leaving its lungs out of its holes from my brother's stabbing still haunts me to this day. You could even see chunks of its lung hanging out of the holes like weird whitish sacs. He stabbed it 4 times, then got off of it and watched it a bit, and we left. I was in shock, but this was actually only one of the disturbing things that happened around my brother and father. Brother went to prison for 10 to 20 years eventually as a young adult. Oh, here is more from my father. We had gotten 2 golden retrievers at the same house. The younger pup was a nice little female who had a problem with finding deer carcasses and dragging them under our deck and munching on the rotting meat. So eventually one day my father snapped and decided to get out the .22 rifle and put her down. Me, my brother, my younger sister, who was 6 or 7 at the time, all ran after our pup, and my dad screaming and yelling to stop. My father then shot the pup right in the snout or nose, straight into her face, and we had to watch her writhe and drown in her own blood for it seemed like an eternity. Only a few seconds in reality, until my father shot her one more time to end it, right in front of his 3 very young children. God, I have tons more stories. No wonder my family imploded. Yeah, that's all pretty terrible. You seem pretty well adjusted considering the literal trauma that you experienced. Oof. Bad. Cleaning up a suicide. A 12-year-old boy shot himself in the head. He had taken a shotgun, wound the trigger around the fireplace and irons, backed up, and shot himself in the eye, killing him instantly. His brains were stuck to the walls and the ceilings and spread down the hall. My husband was asked to do the cleanup while the dad was out of town. I couldn't let him go alone, so we both wound up scraping brains off the wall, scrubbing it, then painting. It's a smell you never forget. I was on a beach in California, pretty remote. A cliff overlooked it, and at the bottom of the cliff there were piles and piles of driftwood logs. I went climbing around the logs and came upon a dying fawn. I figured it fell from the cliff. It must have broken its legs or worse from the fall. It was so dehydrated, barely breathing, I considered carrying it out of there. But it was a long hike out, and almost sundown, and I had no idea what I'd do with it even if I got it back to my car. I considered putting it out of its misery, but I couldn't do it. I stayed with it for a while, petting it and telling it was beautiful, and that I hoped it had some joy in its life. I'm sorry. I wouldn't say weird, but definitely disturbing. Traumatizing, really. My partner died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He literally ate a bullet. His face looked exactly like it did every time I woke up next to him snoring. His eyes were gently closed and his mouth was only slightly open. The color of the blood was effing unreal. I had to grab his shoulders and pull him out from between the wall and a bookshelf he collapsed into. I turned his face to me and felt the blood in his hair between my fingers. I had my hand on his back and he was so warm, but I could feel his heart wasn't beating. His lungs weren't breathing. His blood wasn't moving. I had tackled him basically not 20 seconds prior, and now all that life and presence and soul I felt as a human being existing in the same space as me was completely gone. I immediately felt that he was gone, but I begged for an ambulance anyway. Not soon after that, I heard the last of whatever was in him come out from between the blood leaking out of his mouth. Makes me nauseous thinking about it. I loved horror movies and gore. I laughed when people died and cried in movies. I callously scrolled through hundreds of news articles daily, detailing death and suicide. Ever since then, I can't deal with any of it anymore. Kind of a long one, but here we go. one week in summer when I lived at home, I kept hearing a weird, like, tick, 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 tick in my mom's kitchen, but I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. It was barely perceptible and inconsistent, which indicated to me it wasn't coming from an appliance or anything like that. Every time I went into the kitchen, I would pause and hold my breath to try to hear it, and every time it was there. It drove me a little insane, to the point where I once invited a few friends over to try and figure it out with me. No luck, but they did hear it. One morning I went into the kitchen, and I could hear it easily over the sound of anything else in the room. This was weird because normally I would have to hold my breath in order to hear it all. I ended up finding the spot the noise was coming from, a 90-degree corner of the room about 4 feet up from the floor, because there was something between the paint and the wall of the room, and it was moving a little. I left the room to get my phone so I could take a video of it, and I really goddamn hope I can find this video someday, because I don't have it now. I guess the flash from my phone's camera irritated them or something, because pretty quickly after I started recording, like within 30 seconds, the wasps that had been chewing their way through the wall or something like that finally broke through and began crawling through the hole they had made into the kitchen. So, the source of the noise had basically been the house equivalent of a huge zit, but instead of pus, it was wasps, and I'd caught the moment it popped on video. I ended up getting duct tape over the hole and spraying a bunch of wasp murdering juice into it. I still had to deal with about 5 to 10 wasps flying around in the house after that though. I was walking around Sao Paulo, Brazil on a layover and was all alone walking down a street in the middle of broad daylight. Looked down for 2 seconds, and when I looked up, a homeless man, at least I assume he was squatted between 2 parallel parked cars taking a shit. It wasn't even solid though, it was pure liquid. It gave 2 Fs I was walking behind him and just stood up without wiping, pulled his pants up like nothing happened. It took me a good 15 minutes to forget that image in my head. I'm a first responder, but not the big 3 that most people associate with that term. In the early morning of September 1st, I was called to help the fire department at a house fire. It turned out to be a murder-arson, and I stumbled upon the victim. It's not the first or the last time that I've seen a deceased human due to my career, but this one was different. The body was viciously mutilated with stab and slash wounds, and his head was almost completely removed. Tomorrow's my first day back at work since that crazy morning. Seeing my brother in the hospital, he was brain dead after overdosing on heroin laced with fentanyl. He was hooked up to a bunch of machines because he was an organ donor, so they had to keep him alive till they got things with his organs straightened out. I talked to him for about 10 minutes in private. It felt like I was writing a message and sending it out in a glass bottle, not knowing if they ever got it. I lived in Bahrain during Arab Spring doing anti-terrorism stuff. Not a lot of people know, but they kind of had a similar event in Tiananmen Square. A lot of college kids were protesting in Bahrain, called out to Saudi Arabia for a bunch of tanks. You can probably guess how that went. I don't think the area that happened is even open to the public to this day. I saw a lot of effed up and weird shit while I was there. I still feel bad for the people of Bahrain and the slave labor they're using to build their country. I worked in a trauma center in a big city. I've seen many disturbing things, but this one always stood out for some reason. Usually, we're given a few minutes warning that we have a gunshot wound or a motor vehicle accident on the way, but this one was a train accident. They brought a man in. Right away I could see his lower legs were missing. The EMT came back and handed me the victim's 2 lower legs. The story relayed to us was that the man was a drug addict that bought drugs, used them, and laughed at the drug dealer that he had no money to pay him. The drug dealer held him down on the tracks until the train came by, severing the drug addict's legs at their knees. His kneecaps were gone. The train did a nice job of cleanly cutting his legs. The lower legs I held still had his blue jeans, socks, and Converse. The victim was too stoned to realize or care about his legs. He was cracking jokes. I saw him the next day in the ICU, staring blankly at his bandaged stumps. Witnessed someone getting a cherry tattooed on the head of their dick in a friend's apartment. Ooh. Had to hold him down by all of his limbs as he screamed so loud that my friends almost were evicted from their apartment. Things were wild in the early 90s in the Navy. Witnessed a head-on collision. I was the car directly behind the person who veered into the driver's side door of this poor little old lady. The guy who was driving had 2 huskies roughhousing in the back seat and turned around to separate them, took his eyes off the road, veered over the yellow line right into her driver's side door. Someone ran out of their house, and we both tried to get the door open to get her out. Her head was against the window, which was just pouring with blood, and we couldn't get the door open. I'm on the phone with 911, peering in the window at her to see if I can see her chest rising or falling or any sign of breathing. Had to pull the young driver out of his car, too. He was semi-conscious, but fighting us unintelligibly because he just wanted to lay in his car. The car's front end was destroyed and leaking badly. One dog flew through the windshield and eventually died from his injuries. The other had jumped from the car during the crash and was later found in someone's yard with 2 broken legs. The firemen had to cut the door of the lady's car and pull her out. Given her age and the amount of blood she'd lost, I'm not super confident she made it. Oh, and my 9-year-old was with me at the time. I made her get out of the car and stand in the neighbor's yard because I was nervous another car wouldn't notice we were stopped in the middle of the road and would rear-end us, so she saw the whole thing. Seeing a Great Dane that was sleeping halfway in its driveway and halfway in the street get run over by a pickup truck. Myself and my mother were in the car behind the pickup, and I was riding passenger. I must have been about 9 or 10. I honestly think my brain has instinctively blocked out as many of the finer details as much as possible, but I definitely remember being catatonic for hours after seeing what I saw. I was drinking and swimming with some folks at this little river spot with a train bridge over it that people used to jump off into the water. I was pissing in the bushes and heard a train pass by. After the train passed, there's a lot of screaming, so I come out of the bushes to see what's going on. And people are saying a girl got hit by a train on the bridge, and for whatever reason, my instant response was to climb up and try to get help as if there was anything could be done. Surprisingly enough, after climbing up, there's a teenage girl. Looks relatively unharmed. I mean, you think train accident, you think mush. Besides the fact she's lying face down, unresponsive, surrounded by a few pieces of what my mind decided to register as raw chicken, put my hand on her back to feel if she was breathing, and she wasn't. Right after that, this other guy climbs up, so I tell him she's not breathing, and he says to flip her over so he can try CPR. When the guy climbs up, he rolled her over, and the rest of her brain, it wasn't chicken, fell out of a pretty decent-sized hole in her face where her right eye and nose should have been. Guess instead of jumping into the river when the train was coming, she tried to hug the side of the rail and got clipped by something sticking out of the train. Couldn't really handle raw chicken without feeling uncomfortable for a little bit after that one. At my old house in California, I woke up and I realized I was in sleep paralysis. In the corner of the room, there was a dark figure with some kind of light on its chest. Think Darth Vader's small chest box with small red lights. All of a sudden, I feel the pressure on my chest, like something laying on me in a loud grrr, as if an animal was protecting me from the dark figure. My dog of 16 years had died in that house a few weeks prior. I remember it like it was yesterday. I truly believe my doggy looked out for me that day. Rest in peace, Oso. So I was waiting on my Uber by a crosswalk in downtown Dallas. There was no stoplight at this crosswalk, but it was by a fairly busy road. There was a fairly sizable American SUV, think suburban-sized, waiting at a stop sign to turn right. Then a pedestrian walked in front of him. Unfortunately, the SUV gunned it at the moment to pull into traffic and just plowed him over. I think the driver was watching oncoming traffic was the issue rather than the crosswalk. Not super crazy, but definitely weird to behold firsthand because the SUV went fully over the pedestrian, not just a bump or something. Pretty sure my parents dropped me out at a meth house when I was a kid. Yeah, they were terrible. The parents were super sketchy, and their entire house had random crap piled up everywhere to the point where you couldn't see the floor at all. Toys, clothes, frying pans, trash. They had 2 little kids. One of them was just a toddler and the other maybe 5. Watching them climb over piles of broken beer bottles barefoot is terrifying. In our town of Tehran, Iran, there was a man who had AR'd 4 underage girls and a few other women, as well as theft, robbery, and so on. He was a little mental and drove a stolen motorbike around. When they caught him, the judge sentenced him straight for execution, 5 times, not joking. It was a huge deal, and I can't remember if we snuck out of school to watch it or a school took us out to see it since it was happening 2 streets away from my school. They pulled him up with a crane and a rope around his neck, and I remember he was unfazed by this. He was making faces and showing thumbs up, equivalent of a middle finger to the crowd. It took an awfully long time for him to go, with loud moans and kicks at the end. But when he died the first time, they used CPR to bring him back and hung him again. They did this one more time, and I remember he was blinking but completely unresponsive. On the fourth run, he didn't come back anymore. I guess his heart just gave out. This is etched in my brain, and I find myself thinking about it and how effed up it was.